A very common phenomenon is that we fail to understand others, or that we try to imagine what it is like to be in a certain situation that other person is in, and we fail. Imagine the following. My friend is a hockey fan, and she cheers for the American team, and the American team loses, and that makes her really sad. Now, I try to understand her, not just try to understand that she is sad, but also what it is like for her to be in this situation. And just imagine that I fail, because I simply do not cheer for any hockey team. Another situation, imagine another friend of mine is in a relationship and he's struggling in this relationship, and he tells me a lot about it, and I sort of understand him, I think. And from all he tells me, it seems like most reasonable to that he leaves his partner. But then next time I see him, he tells me he didn't leave her after all. So I tried to understand him, and I thought I did, but somehow I didn't, because now in the situation, he then decided to stay with his partner. So there are several reasons why we fail at understanding others, and we can kind of distinguish two kinds of reasons. Some reasons are epistemic and some are psychological, right? So in the first case, it seems like I know everything about the situation, you know, that her favorite hockey team lost, and she's sad. No, there's nothing else I should know, but still I just don't get it. So in this case, it seems like psychologically, I just can't understand it. In the second case, you know, there might be something that my friend didn't tell me. Now, maybe there are other reasons why he wants to stay with his partner that he didn't tell me. Or, you know, maybe he acted, he was weak in that situation, or he's easily manipulated, and I didn't know that. So maybe there was some stuff that I didn't know in the situation, and that's why I failed to understand him. Now, Peter Goldie has argued that, that he has observed, you know, throughout his work, he kind of argues, and that he claims he has observed that, you know, truly understanding others often fails. And he was always wondering why. And in his paper, Anti-Empathy, he says he finally understood why it tends to fail so much. Well, because it's not possible. There are conceptual reasons why understanding others is often not possible. So the problem is not a contingent one, concerned only with the limits to our powers of imagination. The problem is rather a conceptual one. We can never fully grasp what another person is feeling, thinking, or deciding to do from their perspective. And he goes on and says, only a subject themselves can take the relevant stance towards their own mental states. I will talk a lot more about Goldie's view, of course. But first, I have to say a couple of things about empathy or perspective taking, or trying to understand another person. So I want to talk about empathy as a conscious and often intentional act. But there are different kinds of empathy. There are lower level empathy as well. So sometimes, you know, somebody is sad, and our initial reaction, without thinking much, without even noticing, we get sad as well. So I'm not talking about this kind of empathy. Goldman distinguishes lower level empathy from higher level empathy, and that's what I'm interested in. So in this sense, empathy is perspective taking, in the sense that it's a conscious and often intentional act. And importantly, the content of what we're imagining is not necessarily just emotions. It could be thoughts, feelings, decisions, and so on. Just the inner life of another person. And as I said, it's a higher level empathy, so it has to be distinguished from emotional contagion, which could also be seen as a very basic kind of empathy. And personal distress is a whole other thing as well. So sometimes when somebody is sad, that causes in other people some kind of self-concerned distress. So suddenly they get stressed, but the feeling is not about the other person, but about themselves. So this is not what I mean by empathy. We have to distinguish two different kinds of perspective taking, or shifting, perspective shifting, as Goldie says. The first kind is in their shoes perspective shifting. And not just Goldie makes this distinction, but also lots of psychologists and philosophers. It's a commonly accepted distinction. So in the case of in their shoes perspective shifting, a subject is consciously taking over the perspective of a target in order to imagine what thoughts, feelings, decisions, and so on they would arrive at if they were in the target's circumstances. So in this case of the bunny, if I try to take the bunny's perspective here, I would think, I am Julia and this hurts, right? Not just think, but try to feel how this would hurt. Then the second kind is empathetic perspective shifting. In this case, a subject is consciously taking over the perspective of a target in order to imagine being the other person, and thereby sharing their thoughts, feelings, decisions, and other aspects of their psychology. So in this case, it seems like more is involved. I'm not just taking the situation into account, I'm also imagining actually being that little bunny, Haselmax. So in this case, I would think, I am Haselmax and this hurts. Now, there are several ways in which we can distinguish these two kinds of perspective taking. You know, you could say the difference is the content. The difference lies in who is doing the thinking. In the first case, I am doing the thinking. You know, I imagine myself doing the thinking. I'm Julia and this hurts. And in the second case, it's Haselmax who is doing the thinking, and I imagine being Haselmax doing that thinking. But for us, more interesting now, Goldie distinguishes it in terms of narrative, and these two kinds of perspective shifting in terms of narrative and characterization. So in the first case, I'm only taking over the narrative. Now, what happens here? Kind of the situation. I'm imagining myself in a situation. In the second case, I'm also taking over the psychological makeup of Haselmax. So I'm kind of taking more over to imagine what it's like in this situation. What is a characterization? Well, it's a person's psychological makeup, their intellectual traits and abilities, and also the dispositions to experience emotions. Those may vary for different people. Now, psychologists have done empirical research on these two kinds of perspective taking. And they say if we have sufficient information about the situation and characterization, we can get to know a target's thoughts, beliefs, intentions, emotions, etc. through empathetic perspective shifting. So the second kind of perspective shifting, where you also take over the psychological disposition. But if we have information about their situation but lack sufficient information about their characterization, in their shoes perspective shifting can be helpful, right? However, if the person is much different from us, then obviously in their shoes perspective shifting is misleading. Well, because I don't have these long, beautiful bunny ears, so for me, the situation would be much different than it is for Haselmax, obviously, right? The ears being standing for the psychological makeup. Now, this is a short overview over what I'm going to do. Well, Goldie argues that empathetic perspective shifting is impossible for conceptual reasons. He says that in their shoes perspective shifting is possible, but it's that second kind of perspective shifting that's impossible. And I will argue that, skepticism towards empathetic perspective shifting actually leads to skepticism towards in their shoes perspective shifting, and that the processes underlying these two kinds of perspective shifting are the same. However, we can distinguish two different aims in perspective shifting, even though the processes are the same. And an epistemically ideal context, I will show finally, can pose psychological challenges. So the first part is going to be about the epistemic challenges to perspective shifting, and the second part is going to be about the psychological challenges. But before I get to my argument, I will introduce Goldie's view in more detail. So why does Goldie think empathy, well, he thinks empathy fails in the most important crucial cases where we really try to understand a person, but he also thinks that there's something much better that we can use instead, and that is actually much more useful, which is sympathy. So in the case of sympathy, according to Goldie, we still have an emotional stance. So we still have an emotional kind of understanding of the person, but we're not trying to actually take over their mental states. We're rather just feeling for them. You know, in this case here, if I can't really understand why my friend is so sad, it doesn't matter. I can just feel for her. You know, I feel sad that she is sad. And this actually gives me an advantage because my friend is completely involved in her situation and she can't really understand that her current sadness is not a big deal because, you know, 2 days later she'll feel better, and in a month or so there will be another game and maybe her team will win. So in that very situation she's in, she's kind of irrational. So her emotions are kind of so overwhelming that she can't see that this is maybe not as important as she thinks now. And from an outside perspective, when I'm not even trying to take over her mental states, I know that. So I'm actually in a better position to act appropriately on my emotions than I would be if I tried to feel with her instead of for her. So now I'm going to talk about why Goldie thinks perspective shifting in the second sense fails. He thinks that psychologists make a crucial mistake when they test these kinds of perspectives. Namely, they operate with cases, or they test people with cases that only require a thin notion of rationality. And in these cases, whatever you do, whichever perspective you take, you get the same result because only a thin notion of rationality is required and not any differences in personality. So the differences don't matter. So here's such a case. Assume a subject B wants to have a sandwich for lunch and believes that a certain restaurant is the only nearby place to serve sandwiches. In taking over B's perspective, A imagines being hungry and imagines believing that there's only one place nearby that serves sandwiches. No matter what kind of person B is, if they are minimally rational, A will be able to predict their decision. So here you see this is about prediction, and my second case was actually also a bit about prediction. You know, I didn't predict that my friend wouldn't leave their partner. I thought my friend would leave their partner because I tried to fully understand them. So sometimes we talk about merely understanding, and sometimes we use that understanding to predict certain actions. But I think that's not crucial in this case, this difference. So Goldie says these basic cases are not really interesting. It gets only interesting when we're talking about complex cases. And here are three situations, or three things that could be the case in such complex cases. First, there are relevant differences in the psychological dispositions between A and B. You know, I just cannot react emotional to sports events. Second, there are relevant non-rational influences on B's psychological makeup or decision-making process. That would be the second example. Maybe my friend was just irrational in this moment where he wanted to actually leave his partner. Third, there is significant confusion in B's psychological makeup. And four, B is faced with a psychological conflict, such as having to make a choice between two or more alternatives, where it's not clear to B which alternative is to be preferred. So I'm just going to talk about these two examples here, these two cases. because I think if I can show that it's possible to take over the perspective of somebody, if one or two is the case, or both, then I have shown something. I don't have to necessarily show that 3 or 4 could be the case in a case of successful perspective taking. I mean, these are probably the most interesting cases where we want, or where it's desirable to take somebody's perspective, because we really want to understand somebody who's confused or somebody who's facing a conflict. But I'll start with the first two. So Goldie now introduces his point by reference to Richard Moran, and he says, he makes this distinction that is actually crucial to understanding these two different kinds of perspective taking. So he says, or to understand why the second kind of perspective taking fails. So Richard Moran says that we can take two different stances on our own, towards ourselves. We can take a theoretical or empirical stance, and we can take a first personal deliberative or practical stance. And Goldie says it is just not possible to take the second stance towards another person. Well, why is that? Well, when deciding what to do, he says the kind person has kind thoughts and feelings, but these thoughts and feelings are not typically about the disposition of which they are an expression. The person who loves his spouse seldom thinks that he's doing loving things because he loves her. However, when I try to take over somebody's perspective, as we saw, we have to take the psychological dispositions into account, which means we have to explicitly think about what that person is like. Otherwise, we can't be successful. However, as soon as we do this, we take a theoretical or empirical stance on towards that other person. So we can never actually get into that state that this person is in. So Goldie argues, in a conscious attempt to engage in empathetic perspective shifting, A cannot keep B's characterization in the non-conscious background. A is forced to treat B's characterization from the empirical or theoretical stance, and since this is not what B does, it produces a fundamentally distorted model of B's thinking, and thus must lead to failure of perspective shifting. And one reason why he thinks that is that he thinks the emotions that we have, for instance, in a situation where we're irrational, for instance, in the situation where we don't leave our partner, even though, everything that we know and that we feel tells us to do it, is that these emotions are reason-giving in this very situation. And from an empirical point of view, we cannot see this. We cannot, treat these emotions as reason-giving, because we never feel them from this unconscious first personal deliberative or practical stance. Now just these two examples again. So imagine B is frustrated and sad. A, in an attempt to take over B's perspective, uses her knowledge of B's love of hockey and of a particular team. B's emotional reaction is based on and somehow causally connected to her love of hockey and that particular team, but B is not aware of her own dispositions. She takes a first personal deliberative stance. A, however, uses her knowledge as an explicit premise when taking over B's perspective. She takes an empirical stance, and their perspective taking is basically ruined. The other example, C struggles in his relationship. Given everything C tells A about his relationship, it seems that C is convinced the best thing to do would be to leave his partner. However, A also knows that C is easily manipulated by others. So after confronting his partner, he ends up not leaving her after all. While C is not aware of his disposition at the moment he confronts his partner, A knows about it and takes it into account. So A has an empirical stance and B has this first personal deliberative stance. Now here are some general problems that you can immediately see with Goldie's view, I think he introduces these two stances and thereby distinguishes categorically different kinds of perspective taking, right? He says, you know, this is the problem with the second kind of perspective taking. And of course, the result is that we cannot imagine being someone else, where imagining being someone else means taking the second kind of perspective. However, Goldie argues against psychologists, which is a bit confusing. So his criticism is directed against psychologists, and sometimes he says, you know, they don't really distinguish these perspectives well when they set up their experiments. They should be more careful and make sure these people really know what they have to do, which perspective they have to take. So he kind of criticizes them on an empirical level, yet has this very principle, you know, very conceptual distinction here. And it just seems when you read the paper that Goldie's view is inspired by the assumption that it's metaphysically impossible to be someone else. So if you believe that, then you think you shouldn't be able to imagine being someone else as well, at least if you want, you know, imagination kind of to be the guide towards what's possible and what's not. So now this would be Goldie's view. Maybe I should stop here quickly before I give my criticism, if you have any questions. Otherwise, I would just continue. Okay.
So can you maybe it could be useful for people, I mean, for me, for sure, to just go back to the definitions of in their shoes and empathetic perspective taking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Or here you have, sorry, here you have the more, do you want this?
Yeah, that's useful. Consciously taking okay. So this is empathetic, whereas
exactly.
In their shoes is
just taking over the situation, imagining being yourself in that situation. I can say it here again. So in the one case, you imagine being in Hazen Max's situation. You know, what if somebody pulled you by the ear like that? That's certainly a thing that we often do, right? So what if, you know, what if that happened to me? What would I feel? What would I think, decide, and so on? And the second is, well, what if I was Hasenmax in this situation? And then you imagine having long ears and being pulled by these long, beautiful ears. And then what you feel might be much different from what you feel in the first situation. And then Goldie, yeah, okay.
No, it's just yeah, in their shoes seems to me it kind of gives me the wrong intuitions, but now I get it. Thank you.
No, exactly. It's also not clear, and that Goldie is right here to criticize psychologists, I think, because it's not clear how these terms should be used best. So in their shoes just means literally you in somebody else's shoes, where the shoes are the situation.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we have seen the problem is that we have this empirical stance towards somebody else's personality, or, you know, towards somebody's psychological mental states, let's say, in a certain situation. And that, of course, is a problem if we want to truly understand somebody. So now I'm going to argue that we can take an experimental stance if two things are the case. The first is that empathy is an output, or we understand empathy as an output and not as the process. And the second is if the aim of empathizing is not to be in a state that is qualitatively identical to the target state. So if these two claims turn out to be true, then we have to say that the second kind of perspective taking, where you truly understand somebody else, is possible. Now, some people have understood empathy as the process. So, no matter what the outcome is, you can say in a slightly exaggerated way, what matters is that you're trying to understand somebody else. And of course, there's some truth in that, because that's at least an attempt, right? And it's often, nice of you to try to understand somebody. But I want to understand empathy, or what really matters about empathy, as the outcome of perspective shifting. So imagine S and T want to go on a trip together, or say a vacation. S is traveling from the US and T is traveling from Europe. However, they can still go on the same vacation. They can still share all the experiences in Mexico. That's just a picture. That's how I want to understand perspective shifting. Of course, in the case of perspective shifting or taking, one person would already be in Mexico and the other would join them. So empathy considered as the outcome of the process is not about B's love of hockey. Remember, this was Goldie's complaint, that you'd have to take the empirical stance and then it would be about the psychological disposition rather than a result of this psychological disposition. It's not about B's love of hockey or about C's being easily manipulated. It rather consists in a certain attitude towards the last game and towards the relationship, and the thinking or reasoning in response to or as part of these attitudes, respectively. So where you have to get to is to a certain attitude. But how do you get to this? Well, I think you don't have to get to exactly the same mental state, obviously, qualitatively speaking, because simulation never provides a complete copy. So imagining X, for instance, is never exactly like experiencing X or perceiving X, right? And in perspective taking, we already said, I think I said at the beginning, we are aware that the mental states we are imagining are not ours, and that distinguishes it from personal distress. This is not about me. Understanding my friend who is sad about the hockey game is not about me, and I know that. And when I feel her sadness, I know that this is not my sadness. It's not about my life. Of course, it can cause personal distress as well. And psychologists observe that as well, that, suddenly you start to worry about your own life when you take the perspective of others. But that's something else. And then moreover, complex simulations of complex processes usually come with a certain purpose. And that means, they focus on certain aspects and make other aspects irrelevant. So for instance, practicing on a horseback riding simulator can be very useful, because what gets simulated are the relevant aspects of horseback riding, or one aspect of horseback riding. But that doesn't mean that, the horse that you're practicing on has to have legs, for instance. It doesn't have to have legs, because that's not crucial to what you're trying to achieve. And similarly, when you're trying to understand your friend's sadness, you don't have to also take into account that she doesn't like peanut butter, for instance. It's simply not relevant. So you can focus on whatever is relevant for the simulation. That means if these two things are true, so first it is about the output, and second, the output does not have to be an exact copy of the target's mental states, then we can put our own experience to use. And this is something that Amy Kind has argued. She has argued that, when we imagine things that we haven't experienced ourselves, we just use our own experiences, of course, and put them together. So here's a quote from her. "If you haven't hiked the Las Palmas Oasis train, but you've hiked other trains in Joshua Tree, and you've seen an oasis before, or even just seen pictures of oasis before, then by using your imagination, as Nagel says, by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications to other experiences you've had, it's plausible to say that you could know what hiking the Lost Palms Oasis train is like, even without having done it. Again, we can do this only if it is true that, you know, empathy is about the output and the aim is not to have an exact copy. Now, what can I do in this case here? Well, I may not care about hockey, right? But as a Swiss, I love Roger Federer. Not completely true. I don't mind him, but, you know, I can just try and use my own experience with being happy or sad about him winning or losing. And then I just plug this in, you know, when trying to understand my friend, I just think about what I feel like when Roger Federer loses. And that might be helpful. But here are two challenges. Maybe I haven't had any relevantly similar experiences, or if I take a similar experience, I may fail. And this is actually the case with Roger Federer, because I simply don't care if he wins or loses. I don't mind him as a public figure, but I cannot feel anything. I even tried to watch him in Miami, but he didn't get into the final, so I had to watch somebody else. But, you know, I tried to care a little bit, but I just can't. So, you know, what if I just don't understand what it's like to feel when somebody wins or loses in sports? I just don't really get it. Well, as you probably know, Laurie Paul has argued that, you know, some experiences are just radically different or new to us, and we can't imagine those experiences before we have actually made them. And maybe, you know, being emotional about sport is something I just can never experience, because there's nothing I can do to become emotional about sports. So I am just saying what Amy Kind says here, that might work, but of course it has limits, right? But these limits apply to both kinds of perspective taking. So Goldie says the following: putting yourself in the other person's shoes is, in a sense, and that's the first kind of perspective taking, is less demanding on the imagination as it does not require you to take on the other's characterization as part of the imaginative process. All that is required is, as a starting point, centrally imagining yourself experiencing the narrative, or imagining yourself from the inside having those experiences, responding emotionally, deliberating, deciding what to do, and so on. But taking into account what we have just said about certain kinds of experiences, this is not really the case, right? Certain experiences are so new or different that I cannot imagine them. And I have to say, I cannot imagine being emotional about sports. So in this case, it doesn't help to imagine myself in the situation at all. But again, these limitations are, you know, they apply to both kinds of perspective taking. They apply to in their shoes perspective taking as well. So the second challenge was, you know, if we imagine a similar situation, we might fail because we might be just different people. So if I imagine wanting to leave my partner, and I have all these reasons, and I tell my friend about all these reasons, and I feel quite sure, and then I get into the situation, then I might just leave my partner. So it doesn't help me to imagine this because I'm not irrational in that situation. But, you know, I might be irrational, and I certainly am in certain other situations. So say I'm afraid of dogs, and every time I see a tiny, cute little dog, I want to run. You know, I have this moment where I know this dog is probably not dangerous, but I just can't help. My emotions are reason-giving in this very moment, and I feel like I have to run. And, you know, then I can take this kind of experience and apply it to my friend's situation, even though, you know, the consequences are more drastic in his case. But I can see I can understand how one could be in the situation that one objectively knows what one should do, but still in the situation, it's just not what one should do. So the emotions in that situation are reason giving. So given what I just said, the limitations and also the possibilities apply to both kinds of perspective taking. And the process is actually the same. You just try to get the experience right. Does it even make sense to distinguish two kinds of perspective taking? Well, I think using narrative and characterization is obviously not helpful. But what is helpful, I think, is the further away the experience is from my current situation or anything I have ever experienced, the more I have to engage in scaffolding. Any kind of calls it imaginative scaffolding. And the more difficult it becomes, whether it is about myself or about somebody else. You know, it might be easier sometimes to imagine what it's like for somebody else to be in a simple situation that I've experienced many times than to imagine myself being in a very new situation that I've never experienced. But I think we can distinguish two different aims or targets in perspective taking. So who this is about. And, you know, depending on who this is about, whether I'm imagining something for myself or for somebody else, my actions may differ. So there are two epistemic challenges to perspective taken. First would be we don't have the relevant experiential repertoire to scaffold the experience, so to say, or we don't have enough knowledge about the situation or about a person's characterization. And in the next section, I would show that sometimes we might be in an epistemically ideal situation, but that could actually cause psychological challenges. But I would briefly stop here to see if you have any questions. Okay, then I'll continue.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I have a question. When you describe the limitations pointed out by Kind, you said that those limitations affect equally to both types of perspective shifting, and I see how those difficulties affects to the empathetic perspective taking, but not to the in their shoes perspective taking, because in their shoes perspective taking seems to be propositional. So if you know the relevant propositional content, or if you have the relevant information, then you can calculate, let's say, or at least it's how I see things. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
well, I want to know more about this.
No, the idea is that it's experiential. And the limitations would be the ones pointed out by Lori Paul. So she says, you know, her prime example in her book is having children. So I don't know if you have kids, but if you don't, let's assume I can say to you, okay, just imagine having children and imagine what it feels like to be in this situation. Or actually, her example is the experience of becoming a parent for the first time. So imagine that. And she says, you know, there's no way you can imagine that because it's what she calls a transformative experience. Once you have it, it changes your epistemic point of view, and it also, it changes you as a person. So you get new insight and you actually change as a person. And that's why you cannot possibly imagine this.
Yeah, now I see.
Yeah, and this would be, yeah. So that's why I said, depending on how extreme the situation, how far away the experience is from whatever I'm experiencing now or I have experienced in the past, the harder it becomes, whether it's in their shoes or empathetic perspective shifting.
Thank you.
But I think the limits are only epistemic, you know, or maybe there are there are cases where we just can't imagine it for whatever reasons, but that applies to both perspectives. So now I would talk about psychological challenges, and I think I have about 10 minutes left. Now, fiction, as we all know, can put us in an epistemically privileged situation, right? Why is that? Well, because we get excellent access to the person's, a character's mental states. For instance, through internal monologue. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can quickly look at it. So this is a passage, the last passage in James Joyce's Ulysses, and Molly is thinking, having some thoughts, and we have a direct insight into the words that go, that go through her mind. And there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of yes and no full sentences, really. So in some sense, we can say that the style here suggests that the words we read are exactly the ones going through Molly's mind. It's not very grammatical. It's not like a proper text. It's just words going on in her mind. And we don't learn anything explicitly about her emotions at all. The mental states are presented, maybe one could say, from a first personal deliberative stance, insofar as we can have access to it, right? We cannot have access to what it is like, because how should this be transported? Well, through the style. The idea is that the style kind of helps us to understand her emotions. Here's a second passage. Here we have a very detailed description, so I'm going to read this. This is Septimus in Virginia Woolf's Miss Dalloway, and he's just thinking about killing himself, and after that scene, he is actually jumping out of the window. So he was deserted. The whole world was clamoring, kill yourself, for our sakes. But why should he kill himself for their sakes? Food was pleasant, the sun hot, and his killing oneself, how does one set about it? With a table knife, uglily, with floods of blood? By sucking a gas pipe? He was too weak. He could scarcely raise his hand. Besides, now that he was quite alone, condemned, deserted, as those who are about to die are alone, there was a luxury in it, an isolation full of sublimity, a freedom which the attached can never know. So here we have a very detailed description of the character's mental states. The thoughts and feelings are explicitly being described, which suggests an empirical stance, right? He's not thinking all this, I guess. He was quite alone, condemned, deserted. These are not the words that are going through his mind. I am alone, I am condemned, deserted, and so on. Septimus is feeling deserted, condemned, and lonely. On the one hand, recognizes societal pressure to kill himself, considers positive aspects of life that speak against killing himself, and thinks about how he should go about killing himself. However, he also experiences a feeling of luxury, sublimity, and freedom in his decision to commit suicide. So given all this information, this is quite a complex mental state that we're asked to reconstruct, right? So he's in a very dark place, but then there's also this feeling of luxury, sublimity, and freedom that we're supposed to add. So this actually should help us a lot with understanding what's going on in Septimus. However, empirical research shows that a subject has to overcome certain barriers. One of them is to actually activate the mental process of perspective taking. So actually get into this emotional state. One is, another barrier is to use the correct information. This is very easy in this context. And another one is to overcome your own personal situation or perspective, and this is also very easy because you're just reading this text. But then there is this third one, which is to activate the mental process of perspective taking. And empirical literature again shows that we have more problems doing that when we are given explicit information. So we are actually in a an epistemically excellent situation here, but it is very hard to activate this state emotionally, to actually feel this complex state. Well, why is it that we have problems when there's so much explicit information? One reason could be that this is not what is normally given to us in a situation where we're asked to understand others. Now, what we have to do in ordinary life is read the body language, for instance, or read the tone in which somebody talks to us. And the same researchers have found out that there are certain things in literature that make that easier. They say that it's pluralism concerning characters, situations, and emotions, transportation, whatever that is, how transported you get into the fictional world, literariness, whatever that is, and indirect descriptions that require us to make an inference. So if we have to make an active inference, it is easier for us to feel anything than when we just get the information. But now, of course, the evidence for the target's mental state is much different, and I've argued that in a different paper, in the case of fiction than it is in real life. So in real life, we have experiential evidence, and in, as I said, maybe reading the body language, looking at a person's eye, facial expressions, and so on. And in the case of literary fiction, we have, for instance, repetition, or not full sentences, and a lot of yeses in between the words. So that is supposed to help us to actively read or actively get into that state. Just as a comparison, I watched the movie as well. And in the movie, this is not the scene because I couldn't get a shot of that scene, but in the movie, this scene here is, you see that that Septimus is in a very dark place, and then you suddenly see his face lighten up, and his face, like his expression, gets more relaxed. And this is probably the moment where we're supposed to understand the kind of luxury and freedom that he feels. However, we can't be completely sure what the content of that state is. We are in a much better situation when it's given to us explicitly, then we exactly know what it is, but we might not feel anything. So the epistemically better situation makes it actually psychologically much harder to truly understand, in this case, the fictional character. So here's the conclusion. We can distinguish two different aims in perspective taking, even though the processes are different, are the same or similar. The relevant distinction is between our current experience or experiential repertoire and the experience we are aiming to imagine. In an epistemically ideal situation, a subject has access to sufficient knowledge about the target situation and their psychological makeup, and has the relevant experiential knowledge, right? However, explicit information makes it harder to activate the relevant experiences in the imagination. And the final conclusion, there are only epistemic and psychological challenges to perspective taking, in the sense of both perspectives. There is no conceptual impossibility, as Goldie has claimed. And that was it. Thank you very much.